There is a cave in each of us, Jung told us, where we store the parts of ourselves we cannot bear to see. For the Sigma INFJ, this cave is vast and deep, filled not with crude impulses or simple vices, but with shadow traits so subtle and sophisticated that they can masquerade as virtues for years, even decades. Picture someone who sees through others with laser precision, who understands human nature at levels most people never reach, who walks alone, not from rejection but from choice. Now imagine that this same person carries within him darkness that is proportional to their light, shadowed traits that grow more powerful precisely because they are wielded by someone so perceptive, so self-aware, so seemingly evolved. The Sigma INFJ's shadow is not the shadow of the unexamined life. It is the shadow of the deeply examined life that still contains territories too threatening to illuminate. These are not the obvious failings that anyone might have. They are the specific distortions that emerge when insight turns inward and curdles into something else, when independence becomes isolation, when the gifts that make them rare become the very mechanisms of their self-deception. What makes these shadow traits particularly significant is that the Sigma INFJ, for all their psychological sophistication, tries desperately to hide them, from others certainly, but more importantly from themselves. Yet these traits cannot be hidden, not truly. They seep through in moments of stress, in patterns of behavior that repeat despite conscious intention, in the wake of damage left behind in relationships and situations. They reveal themselves not through confession but through consequence. To understand the Sigma INFJ completely, we must descend into this cave, into the 7 shadow traits they try to hide but ultimately cannot, and in doing so, we discover not condemnation but the full humanity of even the most perceptive among us. The first shadow trait, the one that lurks beneath almost every Sigma INFJ interaction, is what we might call the superiority complex disguised as humble observation. The Sigma INFJ sees patterns others miss. They understand motivations that remain opaque to most. They perceive the games people play, the masks they wear, the lies they tell themselves. This perceptual clarity is genuine, and a gift, but it comes with a dark companion. Deep in the psyche of the Sigma INFJ lives a quiet conviction that they see more truly than others, that they are operating at a level of awareness most people cannot reach. They do not announce this. They do not boast. In fact, they often go to great lengths to appear modest, to acknowledge others' perspectives, to validate feelings they privately consider naive or unexamined. But beneath the diplomatic surface, there is judgment. There is a sense of being fundamentally different. Not just in personality but in depth, as though they are 3-dimensional beings moving through a 2-dimensional world. This manifests in subtle ways. When others share their problems, the Sigma INFJ listens with apparent empathy. But, internally, they are often diagnosing, categorizing, seeing patterns that the other person cannot see, and feeling a mixture of compassion and contempt. The contempt is never acknowledged. It hides behind concern. It disguises itself as wisdom. But it is there, coloring every interaction with an almost imperceptible sense of distance, a knowing that separates rather than connects. The tragedy is that this superiority is both real and false. Real, because the Sigma INFJ genuinely does see things others miss. False, because seeing is not the same as being, and the ability to perceive patterns does not make one superior in the ways that actually matter, in kindness, in presence. In the capacity to let others be fully themselves without the burden of being understood too completely. The Sigma INFJ tries to hide this trait because acknowledging it would shatter their self-image as humble, as empathetic, as someone who serves rather than judges. But it cannot be hidden. It reveals itself in the careful word choices that subtly correct others, in the explanations that go just a bit too far. In the way they can never quite surrender to the moment without simultaneously observing it from outside. The second shadow trait is the manipulation through withdrawal, a power move so subtle that even the Sigma INFJ often does not recognize it as manipulation. Sigmas pride themselves on independence, on not needing others, on being complete within themselves. INFJs, meanwhile, are deeply relational beings who understand emotional dynamics with almost supernatural precision. When these traits combine in shadow form, they create someone who uses absence as a weapon. Who punishes through disappearance, who controls by making others feel their withdrawal as a loss. This is not the aggressive manipulation of threats or demands. It is the passive manipulation of making oneself scarce, of retreating into solitude in ways that leave others anxious, confused, and wondering what they did wrong. The Sigma INFJ tells themselves they are simply protecting their energy, maintaining boundaries, and honoring their need for solitude. And sometimes this is true. But other times, perhaps more often than they would like to admit, the withdrawal is strategic. It is a way of maintaining power in relationships without having to engage in open conflict. It is a way of punishing perceived slights without having to name them. It is a way of keeping others slightly off balance, somewhat uncertain of where they stand, somewhat more eager to please when connection is finally offered again. The genius of this shadow trait is that it masquerades perfectly as self-care. The Sigma INFJ can disappear for days or weeks, fail to respond to messages, and cancel plans at the last minute, all while framing it as necessary solitude, as a means of protecting themselves from overwhelm, and as an act of honoring their introverted nature. And others, understanding that INFJs are sensitive and Sigmas are independent, often accept this framing without question. But those on the receiving end of this pattern feel its impact. They feel anxious about not knowing when the connection will be restored. They feel the implicit message that they are too much, too demanding, too draining. They begin to modify their behavior, approaching more carefully and needing less visibly. And in this way, the Sigma INFJ maintains control without ever having to overtly exercise it. They try to hide this trait because acknowledging it would mean confronting the ways they use their gifts for power rather than connection, the ways their independence is sometimes not freedom but a fortress. But it cannot be hidden. It manifests in the pattern of relationships that never quite deepen, in the people who eventually give up trying to reach them, and in the loneliness that they insist is chosen, but that sometimes feels like a consequence. The third shadow trait emerges from the collision between the INFJ's perfectionism and the Sigma's self-sufficiency, creating what might be called emotional stinginess masked as high standards. The Sigma INFJ has spent years, perhaps a lifetime, developing their inner world, refining their perceptions, cultivating their insights and sensibilities. They have created within themselves a rich psychological and intellectual landscape that few can match. This is admirable, but it creates a problem. Having built something so refined internally, they develop extraordinarily high standards for external relationships and experiences. They want conversations that match the depth of their inner dialogue. They want connections that honor the complexity they carry. They want companions who can meet them at their level. These desires are reasonable, but in shadow form, they become a reason to withhold. The Sigma INFJ becomes like a miser with their emotional investment, constantly calculating whether the other person deserves their full presence, their genuine thoughts, and their real engagement. Most people are found wanting. Most situations are deemed not quite worthy of their full participation. And so the Sigma INFJ moves through life giving carefully measured amounts of themselves, always holding something back, always protecting the precious resource of their inner richness from being wasted on those who would not appreciate it. They tell themselves this is discernment, that it is wisdom born from past experiences of feeling misunderstood or having their depth unappreciated. And again, there is truth in this. But the shadow side is that this stinginess creates a self-fulfilling prophecy. By withholding their whole selves, they prevent others from ever truly knowing him, which confirms their belief that others cannot handle their depth, which justifies further withholding. The relationships remain superficial because the Sigma INFJ never offers the depth that would allow him to deepen. The conversations remain shallow because they never share the insights that would elevate them. They are like someone standing at the edge of the ocean, complaining about shallow water, never noticing that they refuse to wade in deeper. This trait attempts to disguise itself behind the language of boundaries and standards, positioning itself as self-protection rather than self-imprisonment. But it cannot remain hidden. It manifests in the perpetual disappointment, the sense that no one quite measures up, the pattern of keeping everyone at arm's length while simultaneously longing for a connection that penetrates the isolation. The fourth shadow trait is perhaps the darkest and most paradoxical, striking at the very heart of the Sigma INFJ's identity. It is the addiction to being misunderstood while simultaneously resenting it. The Sigma INFJ has built their entire sense of self around being different, being rare, and being the one who sees what others cannot see, operating outside conventional structures. This identity requires, at some level, that they remain misunderstood. If others truly understood them, if they were seen clearly and accepted entirely, they would lose the specialness that comes from being the perpetual outsider. Their identity would collapse, and so, unconsciously, they protect their misunderstood status. They communicate in ways that are just oblique enough to leave room for misinterpretation. They present themselves in ways that emphasize their difference rather than their common humanity. They choose relationships and situations where they are guaranteed to be the odd one out, the one who does not quite fit. And then they suffer from this misunderstanding. They genuinely feel the pain of not being seen. They authentically long for someone who gets them without explanation. But when such a person appears, when someone demonstrates real understanding, the Sigma INFJ often finds reasons to pull away. The understanding feels threatening because it threatens the core identity. If they are understood, if they are not so different after all, then who are they? This shadow trait is insidious because it operates almost entirely outside conscious awareness. The Sigma INFJ would be horrified to realize they are invested in their own isolation, that they are protecting their wounds rather than healing them, that they have made an identity out of being the lone wolf and cannot afford to let the pack accept them. Yet this trait drives so much behavior. The cryptic communication, the emphasis on difference, the subtle ways they ensure that even when they are with others, they remain fundamentally apart. This is the shadow that Jung warned about most strenuously, the ways we become identified with our wounds, making them so central to who we are that healing becomes a form of death. The Sigma INFJ tries to hide this trait because seeing it would require dismantling the carefully constructed identity they have spent years building. Would require admitting that some of their isolation is chosen, that some of their suffering is self-created, and that they are not simply the victim of a world too shallow to understand them. But this trait cannot stay hidden. It reveals itself in the pattern of near connections that dissolve, in the way understanding is simultaneously sought and sabotaged, in the chronic feeling of loneliness that persists even when opportunities for genuine connection appear. The fifth shadow trait is connected to the INFJ's auxiliary function, extroverted feeling, and how it can manifest in shadow when combined with Sigma independence. This trait is the secret people-pleasing that masquerades as authenticity. On the surface, the Sigma INFJ appears to be the opposite of a people-pleaser. They do not seek approval. They do not modify their behavior for social acceptance. They walk their own path regardless of others' opinions. This is the narrative they tell themselves and project to the world. But beneath this narrative lies a more complicated reality. The Sigma INFJ, through their extroverted feeling, is exquisitely attuned to what others want, need, and expect. They read emotional atmospheres like mystics read omens. And despite their claimed independence, they often find themselves subtly adjusting, not in obvious people-pleasing ways, but in more insidious ones. They might share only the parts of their truth that the other person can handle. They might hold back observations that would create discomfort. They might perform authenticity rather than living it, carefully curating which aspects of their complexity to reveal based on what will maintain the relationship without demanding too much of them. This is people-pleasing for people who are too sophisticated to engage in obvious people-pleasing. It is the management of others' perceptions and emotions in ways that allow the Sigma INFJ to maintain their independent identity while avoiding the conflicts and discomfort that true independence would create. The shadow here is that the Sigma INFJ believes they are being authentic when they are actually being strategic, believes they are being independent when they are actually accommodating, and believes they are being themselves when they are actually performing a carefully edited version of themselves. This creates an exhausting double life where they must constantly monitor and adjust their presentation while simultaneously maintaining the story that they do not care what others think. The strain of this eventually shows in burnout, in resentment towards people they have been secretly managing, in sudden withdrawals when the performance becomes too tiring to maintain. They try to hide this trait because it contradicts their core identity as someone who operates outside social expectations, someone who has transcended the need for approval. But it cannot be hidden. It shows up in the disconnect between their professed values and their actual behavior, in the way they are somehow always accommodating while claiming they never accommodate, in the relationships that feel vaguely false even when everyone is being friendly. The sixth shadow trait is the intellectual bypass, the way the Sigma INFJ uses their considerable analytical abilities to avoid feeling what needs to be felt. Introverted intuition, combined with introverted thinking, the INFJ's tertiary function, creates a formidable capacity for psychological analysis and pattern recognition. The Sigma INFJ can analyze their emotions, understand their trauma, identify their patterns, trace their reactions back to childhood experiences. All with remarkable precision, and therein lies the trap. Understanding becomes a substitute for experiencing. Analysis becomes a way to keep the emotions at a safe distance, to remain in the observer role rather than dropping into the vulnerability of actually feeling. The Sigma INFJ can tell you exactly why they struggle with intimacy, can trace it back to attachment patterns and childhood dynamics, and can even see the ways it manifests in their current relationships. However, seeing is not the same as being healed. Understanding is not the same as transformation. The shadow trait here is the way psychological sophistication becomes another fortress, another means of remaining separate from the messy, uncomfortable, and uncontrolled experience of genuine emotion. When difficult feelings arise, the Sigma INFJ immediately shifts into analysis mode. They observe themselves feeling, they understand why they are feeling it. And they can probably even predict what they will feel next. But they do not surrender to the feeling. They do not let it move through them without commentary. They maintain the split between the one who feels and the one who watches the feeling, and in that split, the healing that comes from fully embodied emotional experience cannot occur. This trait is particularly dangerous because it is easily mistaken for growth. The Sigma INFJ appears to be doing the work, They are in therapy, reading psychology, or journaling extensively about their inner landscape. However, this work often occurs at the neck up, in the realm of thought rather than the realm of embodied experience. They are thinking about their feelings rather than feeling their feelings, and the distinction is everything. This shadow trait attempts to hide behind the appearance of self-awareness, behind an impressive psychological vocabulary and a nuanced understanding of their own psyche. But it cannot stay hidden. It shows itself in the patterns that never quite shift despite all the insight, in the emotional flatness beneath the intellectual complexity, in the way they can talk about vulnerability without ever being vulnerable, in the sense that they are somehow living their life from behind glass, seeing everything clearly but not quite touching it. The seventh shadow trait brings us full circle, to the place where all the other shadows converge. It is the martyr complex hidden beneath the hermit's cloak, the secret belief that the Sigma INFJ is sacrificing something profound by existing in a world that cannot adequately appreciate them. This trait is woven from threads of all the others, the superiority that tells them they are operating at a different level, the withdrawal that positions them as protecting themselves from a draining world, the emotional stinginess justified by others' unworthiness, the investment in being misunderstood, the hidden people-pleasing that goes unacknowledged, and the intellectual bypass that keeps them from feeling the full weight of their choices. These elements combine to create a narrative of noble suffering, a story in which the Sigma INFJ is a kind of philosophical martyr. Someone who bears the burden of seeing too much, understanding too deeply, existing too far outside the norm. They tell themselves, often without words, that their solitude is not a choice made from preference, but a sacrifice made for survival, that their guardedness is not self-protection but a necessary defense against a world that would drain or misuse them, that their difficulty connecting is not their responsibility but the inevitable consequence of their rarity. In this narrative, they are tragic heroes, blessed with gifts that curse them to isolation, noble souls too refined for the coarse world around them. The shadow here is the hidden resentment, the subtle blame directed at everyone else for not being deep enough, aware enough, evolved enough to meet them where they are. It is the way they position themselves as the victim of their own gifts rather than taking responsibility for the choices they make with those gifts. And beneath even this is a deeper shadow. The possibility that some of their suffering is not inevitable but chosen, that some of their isolation is not necessary but preferred, that they are not so much unable to connect as unwilling to pay the price that genuine connection demands, the price of being seen in their ordinariness as well as their uniqueness, the cost of admitting need, the cost of risking rejection not based on misunderstanding but based on true understanding. The martyr complex allows them to avoid these uncomfortable possibilities by framing everything as imposed rather than chosen, as a burden rather than a preference. This trait tries to hide beneath narratives of sensitivity and self-preservation, beneath the language of boundaries and self-care, beneath the appearance of someone simply trying to survive in a difficult world. But it cannot remain hidden. It shows itself in the subtle sighs, the implications that others would not understand. The ways they position every limitation as something being done to them rather than something they are choosing, the chronic sense of being underappreciated that never quite resolves, no matter how much appreciation they receive from the few who try to offer it. These 7 shadow traits exist not to condemn the Sigma INFJ but to complete the picture, to honor the full complexity of a personality type that is sophisticated enough to have sophisticated shadows. Jung taught us that the shadow is not evil, it is simply unconscious, and that integrating the shadow is essential to wholeness. For the Sigma INFJ, who prides themselves on self-awareness, confronting these shadows is perhaps the ultimate challenge. As it requires seeing the ways their gifts have been distorted, the ways their strengths have become weaknesses, and the ways their psychological sophistication has been used to construct elaborate defenses rather than to achieve genuine freedom. The path forward is not to eliminate these traits, which is impossible, but to bring them into consciousness, to recognize them as they operate, and to choose differently in the moments when they arise. This requires a humility that does not come easily to those who have built their identity on seeing clearly, a willingness to admit that perhaps they do not see themselves quite as clearly as they see others, that perhaps their cave contains territories they have been afraid to explore. The shadow traits of the Sigma INFJ try to hide, yes. Still, they cannot ultimately succeed in hiding because shadows always reveal themselves through their effects, the patterns in relationships, the recurring struggles, and the gap between intention and impact. What makes the Sigma INFJ truly rare is not just the combination of traits they possess but their capacity, when they choose to use it, to descend into their own depths and emerge with greater wholeness, to face their shadows not with the analytical distance they prefer but with the vulnerable honesty that transformation requires. In the end, these 7 shadow traits are not flaws to be fixed but invitations to deeper integration, calls from the unconscious to expand the circle of self-awareness to include even those parts of themselves that contradict the identity they have so carefully constructed. The question is not whether the Sigma INFJ has these shadows, because having them is inevitable, part of being human and part of having the particular gifts they carry. The question is whether they will have the courage to stop hiding them, even from themselves, and in that stopping, to discover a freedom that is not based on being special or different or misunderstood, but on being whole, complete, integrated, able to hold both light and shadow without needing to perform either one.